Hello and welcome back to my friend the Rainbow Circle. Since I'm on a kick of talking about uh, all the different flaws of the post-Iowa workshop system and the common defenses and why those common defenses are wrong, rainbow branded coffee mugs, buy them in the in the store, in my personal store. I don't have. Um, One of the most interesting ones, I think, is the whole idea of the value of the collective in art. I think that's a very, very positive thing. I'm even obsessed with the collective in art. The whole idea that feedback from well-intentioned peers is an asset. This happens when you get outside. You get things in your eye. I'll go one-eyed. Okay. The whole idea that feedback from your well-intentioned peers is positive. And I think it does actually work in an artistic collective in a radically different way than it does in the Iowa style workshop system. Essentially, the problem with the Iowa style workshop system is that you have people writing in different genres who meet usually for the first time, not always, but usually for the first time in the workshop itself. And so they're not really familiar with each other. So they're not familiar with each other's style. They didn't choose to be there based on a shared aesthetic. They were essentially thrust into that situation. They choose to, seek creative writing education, which I did many, many times in many classes. I wanted some, useful feedback for sure. But the problem is, if you're doing this with strangers, first of all, you have multiple social forces that get in the way of effectively actually doing that. And so you have a lot of advice for workshops about how to spare people's feelings that are really based primarily on the idea of how do you effectively criticize a stranger. You give them compliments, and then you criticize them. And the whole idea of the cone of silence, receiving criticism silently, is to reduce defensiveness, which is entirely wrong-headed. A writer should learn how to defend themselves well. If somebody's coming from a different aesthetic and criticizing a piece, there's no reason not to defend yourself. So instead of reducing defenses to listen to somebody with a different aesthetic criticizing a piece based on a false universal, recognize what the true universal you're basing your writing on actually is. But you can compare this to the experience of the Beats, the ones that I know best, who were friends first, but they became friends based on a shared aesthetic to a degree. So they went to, two of them, went to Columbia University together, and there was a trend at the time that that formalism was the only good kind of poetry. It was a new resurgence of formalism. The dogs might get loud. If the dogs get loud, I will put them inside. So prime example of that is Robert Lowell. Robert Lowell, before he switched to confessionalism, is sort of the token early 50s formalist, and Lewis Simpson, who also went to Lewis Simpson and Don Hall, also went to Columbia University at the same time as Ginsberg. They were formalist, and the style that was really supposedly the only good style, according to professors at Columbia University, was the sort of ironic, distant, very formally structured pieces where you don't talk about yourself. Talking about yourself was a problem. It was highly influenced by new criticism at the time. If the dogs are going to keep barking, I'll put them inside. Highly influenced by new criticism, and but Ginsberg was taking these poetry classes and just arguing that the principles that they were basing their critiques on were entirely wrong, and he had all the right to do that, because he had a great idea of what his poetry should be. He gained that more and more over time. He had a great idea of what poetry generally should be. He was actually a formalist for a good chunk of the early 50s. And he learned to access, his own style through mentorship with William Carlos Williams. Hey, you keeping me safe from people walking down the street? You keeping me safe? Thanks, guys. Okay. The neighbor dog is going to start barking now. So he had a very contentious relationship with his poetry teachers at Columbia University. But then he became friends with Kerouac, who was a fiction writer. And he became friends with, that there's a whole larger group, but those are the significant ones in that particular context. Kerouac was writing novels, and he was attempting to integrate jazz rhythm into his prose. He was experimenting with form. Ginsberg was, they were both big fans of, people like Rimbaud and Baudelaire and Apollinaire and, lots of people like that. And the pro-formalist teachers, the Lewis Simpson type, the ones who loved Lewis Simpson but hated Ginsberg, they rejected Rimbaud, Baudelaire, Apollinaire, and Walt Whitman was out of favor. Ginsberg's biggest hero was Walt Whitman, and Walt Whitman was out of favor. They considered Walt Whitman an interesting anomaly, but a bad poet. But Ginsberg wanted to write like Walt Whitman. So he found Kerouac, and Kerouac was experimenting with jazz rhythms and prose, and that was deeply influential. And so they were really, really good friends, and they knew each other well enough to actually be able to criticize each other, to inspire each other, and to criticize each other. And they had a shared aesthetic, and the aesthetic was a freer, looser form, more of a confessional style. And they met people outside of the university, like Neil Cassidy was very influential through his life, mainly. William S. Burroughs, of course, they met him. He was not a student there. They met him through some contact. Lucian Card, there's a whole complicated story there. And he had a very revolutionary aesthetic. I mean, he's sort of if you think of those three, Ginsberg, Kerouac, and Burroughs, he's sort of the odd man out, but he still had this very revolutionary, anti-conformist sort of perspective that they certainly shared, and they appreciated his perspective because they were good friends with him, and they learned a lot from him based on his life experience, based on the similar taste in pieces. So that sort of artistic collective, where you are able to challenge each other from a loving place, having become friends with each other, being able to say, this is not working effectively from the place of already being a friend. That gets around a lot of the challenges that are inherent in trying to do that with a stranger. Coming into a situation where you don't have a shared aesthetic with others, where maybe the workshop leader has an aesthetic that he or she is enforcing. It's very much like the Columbia University example. That aesthetic is what the poetry teachers there thought was just good poetry. Ginsberg disagreed. And so, who was actually right? Ginsberg was right for his poetry. The poetry teachers were right for their poetry. The style of poetry they favored. So just in that. that dynamic, it didn't work. It worked much better for Ginsberg when he found someone he had a singular mentor in William Carlos Williams who did understand his aesthetic. He didn't have exactly the same aesthetic. Like William Carlos Williams thought Howl was too long, for example. Should Ginsberg really have cut it down? Well, no, of course not. But he understood what Ginsberg was trying to do, for sure. And so that's a much more productive sort of creative relationship. And how do you simulate that in a workshop situation? The shared critique, if you want to simulate that in a workshop situation, the shared critique should really be way at the end of the process. You should do a lot more other than just critiquing the pieces of other writers. Long after you've established things like a shared aesthetic or some sort of concept of the differences in the aesthetic, sharing a rapport of friendship, that sort of thing, so that you're able to get around social barriers of strangers, essentially. So, and I would say, there's very little actual value in the stranger-based workshop that you couldn't better accomplish in some other form, for sure. But anyway, that's my my anti-Iowa rant of the day. See you on the next episode.